howdy y'all, come on over and share this fire with us. We got a bottle passing around and got some coffee over there on the fire pit. We didn't have much else to talk about tonight, so I'd really like to tell you some more of this story by Max Brand, titled The Untamed. Now this is chapter 5, 4 in the air. Dan looked from Morgan to Silent and back again, for understanding primarily. He felt that something was wrong, but what it was he had not the slightest idea. For years, old Joe Cumberland had patiently taught him that the last offense against God and man was to fight. The old cattleman had instilled in him the belief that if it did not cross the path of another, no one would cross his way. The code was perfect and satisfying. He would let the world alone and the world would not trouble him. The placid current of his life would never come to the white waters of wrath. Wherefore he gazed bewildered about him. They were laughing. They were laughing unpleasantly at him, as he had seen men laugh at a fiery young colt which struggled against the rope. It was very strange. They could not mean harm, therefore he smiled back at him rather uncertainly. Morgan slapped at his shoulder by way of good fellowship and to hearten him. But Dan slipped away under the extended hand with a motion as subtle and swift as the twist of a snake when it flees for its hole. He had a deep aversion for contact with another man's body. He hated it, as a wild horse hates the shadow of the flying rope. "Steady up, pal," said Morgan. "The lads mean no harm. That tall man is considerably riled, which he'll now bet his sombrero against you when it comes to shooting." He turned back to Silent. "Look here, partner," he said. "This is the man I said could nail the $4 before they hit the dust. I figure you don't think how it can be done, huh?" "Him?" said Silent in deep disgust. "Send him back to his maw before somebody messes him all up. Why, he don't even pack a gun." Morgan waited a long moment so that the little silence would make his next speech impressive. "Stranger," he said, "I've still got somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 in that cash drawer. And every cent of it hollers that Dan can do what I said he can do." Silent hesitated. His code was loose, but he did not like to take advantage of a drunk or a crazy man. However, $500 was $500. Moreover, that handsome feller who had just taken water from Hal Purvis and was now smiling foolishly at his own shame, had actually ridden Red Peter. The remembrance infuriated Silent. "Hurry up," said Morgan confidently. "I don't know what you're thinking, stranger. Which I'm kind of deaf, and I don't understand the way anything talks except money." "Corral that talk, Morgan," called a voice from the crowd. "You're plumb locoed if you think any man in the world can get away with a stunt like that. Pick 4 in the air?" "You keep your jaw for yourself," said Silent angrily. "If he wants to donate a little more money to charity, let him do it. Morgan, I've got 500 here to cover your stake." "Make him give you odds, Morgan," said another voice, because a glance from Silent cut the suggestion short. After that, there was little loud conversation. The stakes were large. The excitement made the men hush the very tones in which they spoke. Morgan moistened his white lips. "You can see I'm not packing any shooting irons," said Dan. "Has anybody got any suggestions?" Every gun in the crowd was instantly at his service. They were heartily tempted to despise Dan, but as one with the courage to attempt the impossible, they would help him out as far as they could. He took their guns one after another, weighed them, tried the action, handed them back. It was almost as if there was a separate intelligence in the ends of his fingers which informed him of the qualities of each one of these weapons. "Nice gun," he said to the first man whose revolver he handled, "but I don't like a barrel that's quite so heavy. There's a whole ounce too much in the barrel." "What do you mean?" asked the cowpuncher. "I've packed that gun for pretty nigh 8 years. "Sorry," said Dan, passing on, "but I can't work right with a top-heavy gun." The next weapon he handed back almost at once. "What's the matter with that?" asked the owner aggressively. "Cylinder too tight," said Dan decisively, and a moment later to another man, "Bad handle. I don't like the feel of it." Over Jim Silent's guns he paused longer than over most of the rest, but finally he handed them back. The big man scowled. Dan looked back to him in gentle surprise. You see, he explained quietly, you got to handle the gun like a horse. If you don't treat it right, it won't treat you right. That's all I know about it. Your gun ain't very clean, stranger, and a gun that ain't kept clean gets off feet. Silent glanced at his weapons, cursed softly, and restored them to the holsters. By this time Dan had secured a second gun which suited him. He twirled both guns, tried their actions alternately, and then announced that he was ready, and in the dead silence, one of the men paced off the 20 yards. Dan, with his back turned, stood at the mark, shifting his revolvers easily in his hands and smiling down at them as if they could understand his caress. How you feeling, Dan? Asked Morgan anxiously. Everything's fine, he answered. Are you getting weak? No, I'm all right. Steady up, partner. Steady up. Look at my hand. Dan extended his arm. There was not a quiver in it. All right, Dan. When you're shooting, remember that I got a pretty close to everything I own staked on you. There's the stranger getting his $4 ready. Silent took his place with the $4 in his hand. Are you ready? He called. Let her go, said Dan, apparently without the least excitement. Jim Silent threw the coins, and he threw them so as to increase his chances as much as possible. A little snap of his hand gave them a rapid rotary motion so that each one was merely a speck of winkling light. He flung them high, for it was probable that Whistlin Dan would wait to shoot until they were on the way down. The higher he threw them, the more rapidly they'd be traveling when they crossed the level of the marksman's eye. As a shout proclaiming the throwing of the coins, Dan whirled, and it seemed to the bystanders that a revolver exploded before he was fully turned even. But one of the coins never rose to the height of the throw. There was a light cling, and it spun a dozen yards away. Two more shots blended almost together. Two more dollars darted away in twinkling streaks of light. One coin still fell, but when it was a few inches from the earth, a six-shooter barked again, and the fourth dollar glanced sideways into the dust. It takes long to describe the feat. Actually, the 4 shots consumed less than the second of time. That last dollar, said Dan, and his soft voice was the true sound out of the silence. It wasn't good. It didn't ring true. Is it counterfeit? It seemed that no one heard his words. The men were making a wild scramble for the dollars. They dived into the dust for him, rising white of face and clothes to fight and struggle over their prizes. Those dollars with the chips and the neat round holes in them would confirm the truth of a story that the most credulous might be tempted to laugh or to scorn. A cowpuncher offered $10 for one of the relics, but none would part with a prize. The moment the shooting was over, Dan stepped quietly back and restored the guns to the owners. The first man seized his weapon carelessly. He was in the midst of the rush after one of the chipped coins. The other cowpuncher received his weapon almost with reverence. I'm thanking you for the loan, said Dan. And here's hoping you always have luck with the gun. Luck, said the other. I sure will have luck with it. I'm going to oil her up and put her in a glass case back home, and when I get grandchildren, I'm going to point out that gun to 'em and tell 'em what men used to do in the old days. Let's go in and surround some red-eye at my expense. No thanks, answered Dan. I ain't drinking. He stepped back to the edge of the circle and folded his arms. It was as if he had walked out of the picture. He suddenly seemed to be aloof from them all. Out of the quiet burst a torrent of curses, exclamations, and shouts. Chance drew Jim Silent and his 3 followers together. My God, whispered Lee Haines with a sort of horror in his voice. It wasn't human. Did you see? Did you see it? Am I blind? Asked Hal Purvis. And think of me walking up and bracing that killer like he was a 2-year-old kid. I figure that's the nearest I ever come to an undeserved grave. And I've had some close calls. That last dollar wasn't good. It didn't ring true, says he when he finished. I never seen such nerve. You're wrong as hell, said Silent. A woman can shoot at a target, but it takes a cold nerve to shoot at a man, and this feller is yellow all through. Is he? Growled Bill Kilduff. Well, I'd hate to take him by surprise, so he'd forgot himself. He gets as much action out of a common 6-gun as if it was a Gatlin. He was right about that last dollar, too. It was pure lead. All right, Haynes, said Silent. You can start now any time and the rest of us will follow on the way, I said. I'm leaving last. I got a little job to finish up with the kid. But Haynes was staring fixedly down the road. I'm not leaving yet, said Haynes. Look. He turned to one of the cowpunchers. Who's that girl riding up the road, partner? That Calico? Why, she's Kate Cumberland, old Joe's gal. I like the name, said Haynes. She sits the saddle like a man. Her pony darted off from some imaginary object in the middle of the road, and she swayed gracefully, following the sudden motion. Her mount came to the sudden halt of the cattle pony, and she slipped to the ground before Morgan could run out to help. Even Lee Haynes, who was far quicker, could not reach her in time. Sorry I'm late, said Haynes. Shall I tie your horse? The fast ride had blown color to her face and good spirits into her eyes. She smiled up to him as she shook her head in refusal. Her eyes lingered a pardonable moment on his handsome face, with the stray lock of tawny hair follow across his forehead. She was used to frank admiration, but this unembarrassed courtesy was new world to her. She was still smiling when she turned to Morgan. You told my father the boys wouldn't wear guns today. He was somewhat confused. They seem to be wearing them, he said weakly, and his eyes wandered about the armed circle, pausing on the ominous forms of Hal Purvis, Bill Kilduff, and especially Jim Silent, a head taller than the rest. He stood somewhat in the background, but the slight sneer with which he watched Whistlin Dan dominated the entire picture. As a matter of fact, went on Morgan, it would be a 10-man job to take the guns away from this crew. You can see for yourself. She glanced about the throng and started. She had seen Dan. How did he come here? Oh, Dan, said Morgan. He's all right. He just pulled in one of the prettiest shooting stunts I ever seen. But he promised my father, began Kate, and then stopped. She was flushed. If her father was right in diagnosing Dan's character, this was the most critical day in his life. For there he stood, surrounded by armed men. If there was anything wild in his nature, it would be brought out that day. She was almost glad the time of trial had come. She said, How about the guns, Mr. Morgan? If you want them collected and put away for a while, offered Lee Haynes, I'll do what I can to help you. Her smile of thanks set his blood tingling. His glance lingered a little too long, a little too gladly. She colored slightly. Miss Cumberland, said Haynes, may I introduce myself? My name is Lee. She hesitated. The manner she had learned in the Eastern school forbade it, but her Western instinct was truer and stronger. Her hand went out to him. I'm very glad to know you, Mr. Lee. All right, stranger, said Morgan, who in the meantime had been shifting from one foot to the other and estimating the large chances of failure in his attempt to collect the guns. If you're going to help me corral the shooting irons, let's start this roundup. The girl went with him. They had no trouble in getting the weapons. The cold, blue eyes of Lee Haynes was a quick and effective persuasion. When they reached Jim Silent, and he stared fixedly upon Haynes, then he drew his guns slowly and presented them to his comrade, while his eyes shifted to Kate, and he said coldly, Lady, I hope I ain't the last one to congratulate you. She did not understand, but Haynes scowled and colored. Dan, in the meantime, was swept into the saloon by an influx of the cowpunchers, and then that left only Lee Haynes outside with Kate. She had detained him with a gesture. Chapter 6. Laughter. Mr. Lee, she said, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Will you? His smile was a sufficient answer, and it was in her character that she made no pretext of misunderstanding it. You have noticed Dan among the crowd, she asked. Whistlin Dan? Yes, he said. I saw him do some very nice shooting. It's about him that I want to speak to you, Mr. Lee. He knows very little about men and their ways. He's almost a child among them. You seem stronger than most of the crowd here. Will you see that if trouble comes, he is not imposed upon? She flushed a little. There was such a curious yearning in the eyes of the big man. "If you wish it," he said simply, "I will do what I can." As he walked beside her toward her horse, she turned to him abruptly. "You are very different from the men I have met around here," she said. "I'm glad," he answered. "Glad? Well, if you find me different, you'll remember me, whether for better or for worse." He spoke so earnestly that she grew grave. He helped her to the saddle, and she leaned a little to study him with the same gentle gravity. "I should like to see you again, Mr. Lee," she said, and then in a little outburst, "I should like to see you a lot. Will you come to my house sometime?" The directness, the sudden smile made him flinch. His voice was a trifle unsteady when he replied, "I shall." He paused, and his hand met hers. "If it's possible." Her eyebrows raised a trifle. "Is it so hard to do?" "Do not ask me to explain," he said. "I'm a-riding a long way." "Oh, a long rider," she laughed. "Then, of course—" She stopped abruptly. It may have been imagination, but he seemed to start when she spoke the phrase by which outlaws were known to each other. He was forcing his eyes to meet hers, and he said slowly, "I am going on a long journey. Perhaps I will come back. If I am able to, I shall." He dropped his hand from hers, and she remained silent, guessing at many things, and deeply moved, for every woman knows when a man speaks from his soul. "You will not forget me?" "I shall never forget you," she answered quietly. "Goodbye, Mr. Lee." Her hand touched his again, and she wheeled and rode away. He remained standing with the hand she had grasped still raised. And after a moment, as he had hoped, she turned in the saddle and waved to him. His eyes were downward, and he was smiling faintly when he re-entered the saloon. Silent sat at a table with his chin propped in his hand. His left hand, of course, for that restless right hand must always be free. He stared across the room toward Whistlin Dan. The train of thoughts which kept those ominous eyes so unmoving must be broken. He sat down at the side of his chief. "What the hell," said the big man. "Aren't you started yet?" "Look here, Jim," said Haines cautiously. "I want you to lay off on this kid Whistlin Dan. It won't mean anything to you to raise the devil with him." "I tell you," answered Silent, "it'll please me more than anything in the world to push that damn girl face of his into the floor." "Silent, I'm asking a personal favor of you." The leader turned upon him that untamed stare. Haines set his teeth. "Haines," came the answer, "I'll stand more from you than from any man alive. I know you've got guts, and I know you're straight with me. But there ain't anything can keep me from manhandling that kid over there." He opened and shut his fingers slowly. "I sort of yearn to get at him." Haines recognized defeat. "But you haven't another gun hidden on you, Jim. You won't try to shoot him up?" "No," said Silent. "If I had a gun, I don't know. But I haven't a gun. My hands will be enough." All that could be done now was to get Whistlin Dan out of the saloon, and that would be simple. A single word would suffice to send the timid man helter-skelter homewards. The large, lazy brown eyes turned up to Haines as the latter approached. "Dan," he said, "hit for the timbers. Get on your way. There's danger here for you." To his astonishment, the brown eyes did not vary a shade. "Danger?" he repeated wonderingly. "Danger. Get up and get out if you want to save your hide." "What's the trouble?" said Dan, and his eyes were surprised but not afraid. "The biggest man in this room is after your blood." "Is he?" said Dan wonderingly. "I'm sorry I don't feel like leaving. I'm just not tired of this place yet." "Friend," said Haines, "if that tall man puts his hands on you, he'll break you across his knee like a rotten stick of wood." It was too late. Silent evidently guessed that Haines was urging his quarry to flee. "Hey!" he roared so that all heads turned toward him. "You over there!" Haines stepped back, sick at heart. He knew that it would be folly to meet his chief hand to hand, but he thought of his pledge to Kate, and he groaned. "What do you want of me?" asked Dan, for the pointed arm left no doubt as to whom Silent intended. "Get up when you're spoke to," cried Silent. "Ain't you learned no manners? And get up quick." Dan rose, smiling his surprise. "Your friend has a sort of queer way of talking," he said to Haines. "Don't stand there like a fool. Trot over to the bar and get me that jolt of red-eye. I'm dry," thundered Silent. "Sure," nodded Whistlin Dan amiably. "Glad to." And he went, accordingly, towards the bar. The men about the room looked to each other with sick smiles. There was an excuse for acquiescence, for the figure of Jim Silent contrasted with Whistlin Dan like an oak compared with a sapling. Nevertheless, such bland cowardice as Dan was showing made their flesh creep. He asked at the bar for a whiskey, and Morgan spoke as Dan filled a glass nearly to the brim. "Dan," he whispered rapidly, "I got a gun behind the bar. Say the word and I'll take the chance of pulling it on that big skunk. Then you make a dive for the door. Maybe I can keep him back till you get on Satan." "Why should I beat it?" queried Dan, astonished. "I'm just beginning to get interested in your place. That tall feller is sure a queer one, ain't he?" With the same calm and wide-eyed smile of inquiry, he turned away, taking that glass of liquor, and left Morgan to stare after him with a face pale with amazement, while he whispered over and over to himself, "Well, I'll be damned. Well, I'll be damned." Dan placed that liquor before Silent. The latter sat gnawing his lips. "What in hell do you mean?" he said. "Did you only bring me one glass? Are you too damn good to drink with me? Then drink by yourself, you white-livered coyote." He dashed the glass of whiskey into Dan's face. Half blinded by the stinging liquor, the latter fell back a pace, sputtering and wiping his eyes. Not a man in the room stirred. The same sick look was on each one's face. But the red devil broke loose in Silent's heart when he saw Dan cringe. He followed the thrown glass with his clenched fist. Dan stood perfectly still and watched the blow coming. His eyes were wide and wondering, like those of a child. The iron-hard hand struck him full on the mouth, fairly lifted him from his feet, and flung him against the wall with such violence that he recoiled again and fell forward onto his knees. Silent was making beast noises in his throat and prepared to rush on the half-prostrate figure. He stopped short. Dan was laughing. At least that chuckling murmur was near to a laugh. Yet there was no mirth in it. It had that touch of the maniacal in it which freezes the blood. Silent halted in the midst of his rush, with his hands poised for the next blow. His mouth fell agape with an odd expression of horror as Dan stared up at him. That hideous chuckling continued. The sound defied definition. And from the shadow in which Dan was crouched, his brown eyes blazed, changed, and filled with yellow fires. And at that instant, the ominous crouched animal with the yellow eyes, the nameless thing which had been Whistlin Dan a moment before, sprang up and forward with a leap like that of a panther. Morgan stood behind the bar with a livid face and a fixed smile. His fingers still stiffly clutched the whiskey bottle from which the last glass had been filled. Not another man in the room stirred from his place. Some sat with their cards raised in the very act of playing. Some had stopped midway a laugh. One man had been tying a bootlace. His body did not rise. Only his eyes rolled up to watch. Dan darted under the outstretched arms of Silent, fairly heaved him up from the floor and drove him backwards. The big man half stumbled, half fell, knocking aside 2 chairs. He rushed back with a shout, but at sight of the white face with the thin trickle of blood falling from the lip, and at the sound of that inhuman laughter, he paused again. Once more Dan was upon him, his hands darting out with motions so fast for the eye to follow. Jim Silent stepped back a half pace, shifted his weight, and drove his fist straight at that white face. How it happened, not a man in the room could tell, but the hand did not strike home. Dan had swerved aside as lightly as a wind-blown feather, and his fist rapped against Silent's ribs with a force that made the giant grunt. Some of the horror was gone from his face, and in its stead was baffled rage. He knew the scientific points of boxing, and he applied them. His eye was quick and sure. His reach was whole inches longer than his opponent's. His strength was that of two ordinary men. What did it avail him? He was like an agile athlete in the circus playing tag with a black panther. He was like a child striking futilely at a wavering butterfly. Sometimes this white-faced laughing devil ducked under his arms. Sometimes a sidestep made his blows miss by the slightest fraction of an inch. And for every blow he struck, 4 rained home against him. It was impossible. It could not be. Silent telling himself that he dreamed, and those dancing fists that crashed into his face and body like sledgehammers. There was no science in the thing which faced him. Had there been trained skill, the second blow would have knocked Silent unconscious, and he knew it. But Dan made no effort to strike a vulnerable spot. He hit at anything which offered. Still he laughed as he leapt back and forth. Perhaps mere weight of rushing would beat the dancing will-o'-the-wisp to the floor. Silent bored in, and with lowered head he clutched at his enemy. Then he roared with triumph. His outstretched hands caught Dan's shirt as the latter flicked to one side. Instantly they were locked into each other's arms. The most meaning part of the fight followed. The moment after they grappled, Silent shifted his right arm from its crushing grip on Dan's body and clutched at the throat. The move was as swift as lightning, but the parry of the smaller man was still quicker. His left hand clutched Silent by the wrist, and that mighty sweep of arm was stopped in midair. They were in the middle of the room. They stood perfectly erect and close together, embraced. Their positions were a ludicrous resemblance to the posture of dancers, but their bodies were trembling with effort. With every ounce of power in his huge frame, Silent strove to complete his grip at the throat. He felt the right arm of Dan tightening around him closer, closer, closer. It was not a bulky arm, but it seemed to be made of linked steel which was shrinking into him, and promised to crush his very bones. The strength of this man seemed to increase. It was limitless. His breath came struggling under that pressure, and the blood thundered and raged in his temples. If he could only get at that soft throat. But his struggling right hand was held in a vice of iron. Now his numb arm gave way slowly, inevitably. He ground his teeth and cursed. His curse was half a prayer, for answered there was the unearthly chuckle just below his ear. His hand was moved back, down, around. He was helpless as a child in the arms of its father. No, helpless as a sheep in the constricting coils of a python. An impulse of frantic horror and shame and fear gave him a redoubled effort for an instant. He tore himself clear and reeled back. Dan planted 2 smashes on Silent's snarling mouth. A glance showed the large man the mute, stained faces around the room. The laughing devil leaped again. Then all pride slipped like water from the heart of Jim Silent, and in its place was only icy fear. Fear not of a man, but of animal power. He caught up a heavy chair and drove it with all his desperate strength at Dan. It cracked distinctively against his head, and the weight of it fairly drove him under the floor. He fell with a limp thud on the boards. Silent, reeling and blinded, staggered to and fro in the center of the room. Morgan and Lee Haynes reached Dan at the same moment and kneeled beside him. Well, that was a heck of a story, folks, and thanks for coming. We had a good time this evening, and, I got more of that story. I'm going to tell you the rest of it, too. We'll tell maybe next time I see you around this here campfire. So bring your mugs. Got something good to drink? Well, sit down and share some laughs and tell some more stories. So good night, folks, and until next time, this is Clay Steele. Be good.